Her fake divorce prank turned real when her whole life fell apart, and I didn't lift a finger. Sometimes the cruelest jokes reveal the most honest truths about someone's character, and Olivia's elaborate prank taught me everything I needed to know about the woman I'd been planning to marry. I was a software quality assurance specialist at a tech company in Phoenix, the kind of guy who debugged code for a living and approached problems with methodical precision. For 2 years, I'd been dating Olivia Martinez, a lifestyle blogger who documented everything from her morning smoothie recipes to her skincare routines for her growing social media following of nearly 50,000 people. She had this infectious energy that initially drew me in, always planning the next post or brainstorming content ideas that would get her more engagement and brand partnerships with fitness companies and beauty brands. What I didn't realize was that I'd become just another prop in her quest for viral moments, appearing in her stories when she needed to show off a stable relationship or demonstrate couple goals for her audience. I'd been saving for 8 months to buy her the perfect engagement ring, a 2-carat princess cut solitaire that cost me nearly $6,000, hidden in my sock drawer while I planned the ideal proposal at the Desert Botanical Garden where we'd had our first official date. The ring represented everything I thought we were building together. A future based on genuine love and mutual respect rather than manufactured drama for internet strangers who followed her every move and commented on our relationship dynamics. That Thursday evening in March, I walked into our shared apartment expecting a quiet night of Thai takeout and maybe watching the new Netflix series she'd been wanting to binge, but instead found Olivia sitting at our dining table with a man I didn't immediately recognize, both of them looking unusually serious and professional. The stranger was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that screamed community theater costume rather than legal professional, and he had a stack of official-looking papers spread between them while speaking in what sounded like rehearsed legal jargon about asset division, property rights, and dissolution proceedings that made no sense given our unmarried status. My first thought was genuine confusion about who this person was and why he was in our home discussing legal matters, then growing dread as I slowly realized they were discussing divorce papers and custody arrangements for a marriage that had never existed and children we'd never had. Olivia had strategically set up her professional ring light in the corner and positioned her phone camera on a tripod to capture every angle of my anticipated reaction, expecting me to panic, break down, and beg for reconciliation while she eventually revealed it was all an elaborate prank designed to go viral and boost her follower engagement. The man introduced himself as Cameron Mitchell, supposedly her divorce attorney, though something about his nervous demeanor, the way he kept glancing at Olivia for cues, and his obviously rehearsed responses made me immediately suspect he was just another struggling actor she'd recruited from her extended social network to participate in her social media theater. As I listened to Cameron stumble through fake legal procedures about dividing assets we'd never legally combined, discussing alimony payments that made no legal sense, and referencing court dates that didn't exist, I felt a cold clarity wash over me about the woman I'd been planning to propose to in just 3 weeks. She was willing to simulate the complete destruction of our relationship for content, to weaponize my deepest emotions and fears about abandonment for views and likes from strangers who didn't know us personally or care about our actual happiness beyond the entertainment value we provided. I found myself studying Olivia's face as she waited expectantly for my emotional breakdown, seeing the barely contained excitement in her eyes as she anticipated capturing my most vulnerable moment for her brand and the way she kept glancing at her phone screen to make sure the camera was recording properly, and I realized with startling certainty that someone capable of such elaborate and calculated cruelty wasn't someone I wanted to spend my life with or raise children with. Instead of delivering the dramatic meltdown Olivia had scripted in her head, I surprised everyone in the room by nodding thoughtfully and asking Cameron practical questions about the timeline for asset division and whether I needed to find my own legal representation. I watched Olivia's confident expression shift to confusion as I calmly inquired about the logistics of separating our finances and asked for clarification on the custody arrangements he'd mentioned, even though we had no children together. Cameron began stumbling over his fake legal responses, clearly unprepared for someone who was treating his performance as if it were a legitimate legal proceeding rather than breaking down in tears or anger. The more questions I asked about filing deadlines and court procedures, the more obvious it became that he was just some struggling actor Olivia had recruited, probably promising him exposure on her social media platforms in exchange for his participation in this elaborate charade. While Olivia grew increasingly frustrated that her carefully planned prank wasn't producing the viral content she'd envisioned, I found myself experiencing an unexpected sense of relief and clarity about our relationship that I hadn't felt in months. I excused myself to think about the terms they'd presented, telling them I needed some time to process this information and would get back to them with my decision by the weekend. What I was really doing was giving myself space to pack my belongings methodically while they sat in the living room, probably celebrating what they assumed was successful footage for her blog. I moved through our apartment with the same systematic approach I used for debugging code, collecting my clothes, electronics, books, and the few pieces of furniture I'd contributed to our shared space. The engagement ring I'd been hiding came out of the sock drawer and went onto the kitchen counter next to a brief note that simply read, "Thanks for showing me who you really are before I made the biggest mistake of my life." I loaded everything into my Honda Civic in 3 trips, listening to Olivia and Cameron's muffled conversation through the apartment walls as they reviewed the footage and planned how to edit it for maximum impact. By the time I drove away from our complex that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd just avoided walking into a trap that would have cost me my emotional well-being and probably my financial stability. The woman I'd been planning to propose to had just revealed that she saw our relationship as content to be exploited rather than something sacred to be protected, and that revelation was worth more than any engagement ring I could have bought. Olivia didn't discover my departure until several hours later when she returned to find my key on the counter next to the engagement ring, and initially she assumed I was playing along with an extended version of her prank by pretending to move out temporarily. I spent that first night at my colleague Marcus's apartment, sleeping on his couch while I processed what had just happened and started making plans for my immediate future. The next morning, I called my company's HR department and requested an emergency transfer to our Seattle office, a move I'd been considering for months but had delayed because of my relationship with Olivia. Within 48 hours, I'd secured temporary housing in Seattle, arranged for my belongings to be shipped, and blocked Olivia on every social media platform, email account, and messaging app we'd ever used together. Her social media post about the hilarious divorce prank she'd pulled on her boyfriend went live that Saturday morning, complete with edited footage of Cameron's fake legal presentation and her excited commentary about the brilliant content they'd created together. What she hadn't anticipated was the immediate and overwhelmingly negative response from her followers, who called her manipulative, cruel, and emotionally abusive rather than finding her elaborate deception entertaining or clever. The comments section became a battlefield of people sharing their own stories about partners who'd weaponized their emotions for social media content, relationship experts condemning her behavior as psychological manipulation, and former fans expressing disgust at her willingness to exploit someone's trust for views. Cameron, realizing that his participation in the prank had caused real damage to someone's life and was now associated with his acting career, quickly distanced himself from the entire situation and refused to help Olivia with any damage control efforts. Her desperate attempts to reach me through mutual friends, work colleagues, and even my family members were met with complete silence as I'd already informed everyone important in my life about what had happened and asked them not to share any information about my whereabouts or plans. She tried calling my work number, but I'd already arranged with my manager to forward any personal calls to HR, and she attempted to show up at my old apartment complex only to discover that I'd already terminated my lease and left no forwarding address. The Seattle transfer became official within a week, and I found myself starting fresh in a city where Olivia had no connections, no mutual friends, and no way to track down my new address or workplace location. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around someone's emotional volatility or constantly being recruited as a prop in someone else's performance, and the relief was more profound than I'd expected. The social media backlash against Olivia continued to snowball throughout the following weeks as her follower count dropped from nearly 50,000 to less than 35,000, with people actively sharing screenshots of her cruel prank across multiple platforms and relationship advice accounts using her video as an example of toxic behavior to avoid. Major lifestyle and beauty brands that had previously sponsored her content began quietly severing their partnerships, unwilling to associate their products with someone who'd gained notoriety for emotionally manipulating her partner for entertainment purposes. I watched this unfold from my new apartment in Seattle through mutual friends who kept me updated, not out of malice, but because they were genuinely shocked by how completely her attempt at viral content had destroyed her online reputation and income stream. Olivia tried desperately to control the narrative by posting long explanations about how the prank was meant to be harmless fun and that people were overreacting, but each defensive post only made her appear more tone-deaf and manipulative to audiences who could clearly see the calculated cruelty in her original content. Several prominent relationship therapists and social media psychology experts began referencing her video in their own content about the dangers of performative relationships and emotional manipulation tactics, ensuring that her moment of infamy would continue circulating long after she'd hoped people would forget about it. The friends we'd shared in Phoenix began reaching out to me privately, many admitting they'd always felt uncomfortable with how Olivia treated our relationship like content to be consumed rather than something private and sacred between two people who supposedly loved each other. My best friend Jake told me that several people in our social circle had tried to warn him about Olivia's behavior over the months leading up to the prank, but he'd never found the right words to express his concerns without sounding like he was attacking my relationship choices. Most telling was hearing that even Olivia's closest female friends had started distancing themselves from her after seeing how readily she'd betrayed someone who'd loved and supported her, realizing that if she could do something so cruel to her boyfriend of 2 years, she probably wasn't someone they could trust with their own personal information or emotional vulnerability. 3 months into my new life in Seattle, I was settling into a rhythm of work, exploring the city, and genuinely enjoying my independence when Olivia made her most desperate attempt yet to salvage our relationship by flying across the country unannounced to confront me at my new apartment building. She'd somehow tracked down my address through a combination of social media detective work and probably bribing someone at my old workplace, arriving on a Saturday morning with luggage and what appeared to be a carefully rehearsed speech about reconciliation and second chances. I was returning from my weekly grocery shopping trip when I found her sitting on the steps outside my building, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and an air of desperation that was almost palpable. She jumped up when she saw me approaching, launching into an elaborate apology about how the prank had been a terrible mistake and that she'd learned so much about herself and our relationship in the months since I'd left Phoenix. Olivia begged me to make a joint video with her explaining that the divorce prank had been mutually planned content and that we were back together and stronger than ever, promising to delete all the original footage and never involve our relationship in her social media content again if I'd just give her one more chance to prove she'd changed. I listened patiently to her entire presentation, noting how even her apology felt performative and calculated, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror while timing it for maximum emotional impact rather than speaking from genuine remorse or understanding of what she'd done wrong. When she finished talking, I calmly explained that the prank hadn't destroyed our relationship but had simply revealed what kind of person she really was underneath the carefully curated social media persona, and that revelation couldn't be undone with apologies or promises to behave differently in the future. I told her about Grace, the marine biology graduate student I'd been dating for the past month, someone who understood the difference between sharing your life with someone and exploiting that person for content consumption by strangers on the internet. Olivia's reaction to learning about Grace was immediate and volatile, shifting from desperate pleading to angry accusations about how I was throwing away years of history for some random woman I barely knew, completely missing the irony that she'd been willing to throw away our entire relationship for a few minutes of viral video content. Her emotional breakdown outside my apartment building attracted the attention of several neighbors and passersby who began recording her increasingly dramatic outbursts with their phones, creating yet another viral moment, but this time with Olivia as the object of mockery rather than the creator of content. I watched her realize what was happening as she noticed the phones pointed in her direction, seeing the exact moment when she understood that her public meltdown was being captured and would probably end up on social media platforms where people who already knew her story would have even more ammunition to criticize her behavior and decision-making. 6 months later, I was attending our mutual friend Sarah's wedding in Phoenix, having flown back with Grace for what would be my first time in the city since leaving after Olivia's prank, when I encountered Olivia for what I knew would be the final time in our complicated history together. Grace and I had gotten engaged the previous month after a romantic proposal during a weekend camping trip in the Cascade Mountains, and I was genuinely excited to introduce her to the friends from my old life who had supported me through the aftermath of Olivia's betrayal. The wedding reception was being held at a beautiful resort in Scottsdale, and I was enjoying catching up with old colleagues and friends when I spotted Olivia across the room, looking dramatically different from the confident lifestyle blogger I'd once known. She had lost a significant amount of weight and appeared almost gaunt, wearing a dress that hung loosely on her diminished frame, and her once perfectly styled hair looked limp and lifeless under the reception lighting. According to our mutual friends, her social media following had continued to decline until she was left with fewer than 8,000 followers, mostly hate watchers who enjoyed commenting cruel things on her increasingly desperate attempts to rebuild her brand and reputation. Her lifestyle blog had completely failed after all her major sponsors dropped her, and she'd been forced to take a job at a customer service call center while moving back in with her parents in their small 2-bedroom apartment outside Phoenix. I learned that she'd gone through a series of unsuccessful relationships with increasingly younger and more naive men who initially fell for her appearance but quickly grew tired of her neediness, manipulation tactics, and constant attempts to involve them in social media content that never gained any meaningful traction or engagement. During the cocktail hour, Olivia approached our table where Grace and I were sitting with several other couples, clearly having worked up the courage to make one final attempt at reconciliation or at least some kind of closure conversation. She looked directly at me and announced that she needed to know how I could throw away 3 years of shared history and genuine love over what she still insisted was just one stupid joke that had been blown completely out of proportion by people who didn't understand our relationship dynamics. I remained seated and calmly introduced Grace as my fiancée, watching Olivia's face crumple as she processed this information and realized that I hadn't just moved on from her but had found someone who made me genuinely happy in ways she never had. Grace, who knew the entire story of Olivia's prank and had actually watched the original video during one of our early conversations about past relationships, handled the confrontation with impressive grace and maturity, simply extending her hand in greeting and mentioning how much she enjoyed hearing stories about my time in Phoenix from my perspective. Olivia stared at Grace's engagement ring, which was actually smaller and more modest than the one I'd originally bought for her, but somehow felt more meaningful because it represented a real commitment between two people who valued each other's emotional well-being over social media performance and external validation. The other wedding guests at nearby tables, many of whom remembered Olivia's cruel prank and had heard updates about my life through the social media grapevine, began giving her increasingly cold stares and pointed looks that made it clear she wasn't welcome in this social circle anymore. I thanked Olivia for helping me realize what I actually wanted in a partner and what kind of love I deserved, explaining that her prank had been the best thing that ever happened to me because it revealed her true character before I made the irreversible mistake of proposing marriage to someone who saw relationships as content to be monetized rather than bonds to be cherished and protected. The conversation ended with Olivia standing alone as Grace and I returned to celebrating with people who genuinely cared about our happiness, and I watched her walk toward the exit with the defeated posture of someone who finally understood that some bridges can't be rebuilt once they've been deliberately burned down for entertainment purposes. Grace and I moved to San Diego 8 months after the wedding encounter, where I'd been offered a promotion to lead quality assurance engineer at my company's West Coast headquarters, and she'd been accepted into a prestigious PhD program in marine conservation at UC San Diego. Our new life together felt like everything I'd imagined a healthy relationship could be, built on mutual respect, genuine support, and the kind of quiet contentment that doesn't need to be performed for an audience of strangers on social media platforms. We bought a small house near the coast where Grace could pursue her research on coral reef restoration while I developed new software testing protocols for environmental monitoring systems. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something meaningful with someone who valued substance over spectacle. One evening while I was organizing our home office, I found an unread email notification that had somehow bypassed my spam filters, sent from an address I didn't immediately recognize until I saw Olivia's name in the signature line. The message was a long, rambling attempt at an apology filled with explanations about how she'd been going through a difficult period of self-reflection and therapy, claiming she finally understood how cruel and manipulative her prank had been and asking if we could have some kind of closure conversation that would help her move forward with her life. She mentioned that she'd seen photos of our engagement on social media through mutual friends and wanted me to know that she genuinely wished us happiness, though the tone of her message suggested she was hoping for some kind of response that would validate her journey of personal growth and rehabilitation. I read through her email twice, noting how even her apology still centered her own emotional needs and desire for absolution rather than truly acknowledging the damage she'd caused or accepting responsibility without expecting anything in return from me. After showing the message to Grace, who laughed and suggested I simply delete it without responding since engaging with Olivia would only encourage more contact attempts, I realized that the woman who'd once seemed so important to my life had become completely irrelevant to my happiness and future plans. I deleted Olivia's email without responding and blocked her new email address, then spent the evening planning our real wedding with Grace, someone who understood that love meant protecting each other's vulnerabilities rather than exploiting them for entertainment. According to the occasional updates I heard through old Phoenix friends, Olivia continued posting to her remaining few hundred followers about toxic masculinity and men who couldn't take jokes, apparently never truly understanding that her problem wasn't my sense of humor but her willingness to weaponize trust for social media content. The last I heard, she was working at a different call center and dating a college sophomore who was too young and inexperienced to recognize her manipulation tactics, but I'd stopped caring about her story the moment I realized that the best revenge wasn't hatred or anger but simply living well with someone who deserved my love and reciprocated it authentically.